There was a pastor of a large, rich suburban church, and during his children's sermon, he told the kids that he was like a shepherd, and the members of his congregation were like the sheep. He then put this question to them. He said, "What does a shepherd do for his sheep?" Always dangerous to ask questions during children's sermons, because you never know. Little kid raised his hand and said, "He fleeces them." Yeah. Kid obviously knew a lot about sheep. Just remind me to not use that example during stewardship season. But still, it brings to mind the reputation that shepherds had during Jesus' day. People didn't think very highly of shepherds. Shepherds sometimes allowed their sheep to graze on other people's land. Shepherds were here today, gone tomorrow, going from pasture to pasture. Sometimes they left town without paying their bills. Sometimes they left with other people's prized possessions. Shepherds also lived lonely, desolate, isolated lives. They seldom developed anything in the way of what we would call social graces. Shepherds were sometimes not even allowed to appear as witnesses in court because, quite frankly, people didn't trust them. So it's an interesting name that Jesus attaches to himself when he calls himself the Good Shepherd. He seemed even glad to identify with shepherds, despite their dubious nature. But we need to be careful about selling shepherds short. George Adam Smith, a 19th century biblical scholar, tells of traveling one day in the Holy Land and coming across a shepherd and his sheep. He fell into conversation with him, and the man showed him the pen in which he led his sheep into at night. It consisted of 4 walls with a single way in. So Smith asked him, "This is where you take the sheep at night?" Shepherd said, "Oh yeah, this is where I bring them all, and when they're in here, they're perfectly safe. But there's no gate to keep them in," said Smith. Oh, the shepherd says, "I am the gate." You can check it out in the front of the bulletin, what it looks like. Now you need to know this man wasn't, see, how many of you actually even looked at the front of the bulletin? Okay, there you go. Thank you, Horace. There's one. Okay. You have to know this man that Smith was talking to wasn't a Christian. He wasn't speaking the language of the New Testament. He was speaking from an Arab shepherd's point of view. So Smith asked him, he said, wait a minute, what do you mean you are the gate? He says, well, when the sun goes down and all the sheep, I've put them inside, I lay in the open space, and no sheep ever goes in or out except across my body. And no wolf will come in except across my body. See, I am the gate from which the sheep go in and out. Now, shepherds, for all their faults, were also fiercely loyal and devoted to their sheep. They led their sheep. They provided food for their sheep. They provided water for them. They found safe places for them to sleep and searched for them when they were lost. They tended to their wounds when they were hurt, and they protected them from wild animals. Now, knowing that, the image of the Good Shepherd is a little more appealing. Jesus chose to identify with the shepherd precisely because a shepherd nurtured and protected his flock. And that's what Jesus does for us. Interestingly, the shepherd not only cares for his sheep, but he also knows them by name. Wherever they might wander off, all he has to do is call out for them, and they'll come running. And they'll come running because they know who he is, and they know that in his care they'll be safe, and they recognize his voice because they have listened to them. There's an interesting experiment they did a number of years ago. This isn't in the bulletin. I just made it up right now. Glenda, where, I didn't actually make it up, I remembered it, where they took all these sheep from different shepherds and mixed them in their flock. So there were sheep from about a dozen different shepherds' stuff. And each one could call his sheep and go one way or the other way. And all the sheep that were his would go. They don't have to have what do you put there on the cows? Not a tattoo, a brand. They didn't have to be branded, didn't have anything like that. All they had to do was hear his voice and they came. And I think that was really amazing. Now, that being said, that's how I think Jesus is. Day in and day out, Jesus calls us. And when he calls us by name too. Our names are important because they identify us, right? We like having our names used. It makes us feel known. It almost makes us feel special, not just one of the crowd. You know, I find it a difference when somebody comes up and say, "Hey, Tom, how you doing?" Rather than just, "Hey, how are you, bud?" It makes a difference. Of course, there's one glaring example to that. Anybody know what that is? Salesman. I hate it when a salesman uses my name like he knows me and then uses it over and over and over again, right? Okay. Jesus isn't a salesperson. That's the good news. Jesus isn't trying to sell us anything, and he knows us better than anyone, doesn't he? Church bulletin board read, "Everybody welcome." It sounds good. It sounds friendly. But you see, the Good Shepherd doesn't say just everybody's welcome. He says, "Lisa, you're welcome. Libby, you're welcome. Edward, you're welcome." And he goes around and calls each and every one of us by name. Jerry, you're welcome. Dave. Okay, Dave, you're welcome. He calls us all. And I lost my place. I'm getting there. It's almost now, maybe you say, see, when you go off script, it's really hard to get back. Now, you might say, well, yeah, I don't hear him calling me by name. And that might be true. And maybe when we feel that way, it's not that Jesus isn't calling, it's just that we're not listening. There's an analogy of, this is also not in there, Glenda, sorry, of a radio. I know she's going, "God, you gave me the script and now I can't find anything." Just hang out with me. Of a radio. The old radios that you had to tune in. And the thing was, if you really wanted to hear them, you had to turn it to just the right spot, and you have to turn it. And I think that's the way our lives are. If we really want to hear God, if we really want to hear what God wants for us, we need to turn our lives a little bit this way and a little bit that way, so that we can maybe be more in prayer, maybe be more in the scriptures, maybe just be open to listening what God has to say. And as we turn just right, we hear God's voice. Truth is, most of us don't hear Jesus with our ears, but we hear him with our hearts and our spirits. So listen, and you're going to hear, and you're here. But not only that will you hear God's Spirit within you, you're going to hear God calling us to great things, to great responsibilities, great lives. Today, many seminarians are people in not just their 20s and 30s, but 40s, 50s, and some even older. I was in my mid-40s, or almost my late 40s, when I graduated from seminary. I was a little slow. My radio didn't tune very well, but I'm certainly glad when I got it in tune. Many of those in seminary had determined that their lives were just missing something. They were too small, and so they answered Christ's call to a larger life. I remember when I felt God's call, my life had been pretty small up to that point. And I felt like this was what God wanted me to do, but you couldn't just stop there. Then I had to do something about it. And so I enrolled in seminary, and it was a crazy 4 years. And I've mentioned that in previous sermons, so I won't say a lot about that. But all of us who go to seminary have to sacrifice something. There was this couple that I met when I was in seminary. Great couple. They knew that they were missing something in their lives. He was a lawyer, and she was a doctor, a physician. I think she worked for Kaiser. Both were doing well in their chosen careers. Both were very successful, but something was missing. So they searched and searched for meaning in their lives, but it always seemed to elude them. Representing big corporate clients didn't bring joy into Dan's life. And being a doctor at an HMO frustrated his wife, and I can't remember her name. I tried to remember it, but I can't. But more and more, they were just feeling out of touch. And then one day, she was in church, and it hit her. Christ was calling her to heal people in a very different way. Well, it took Dana, I think, a few years longer to realize that he was also being called away from the courtroom and into the pulpit. But eventually, they both got the message, and I went to seminary with them at the same time that they were there. They had quit their jobs. They moved to San Francisco Theological Seminary. They gave up, each had 6-figure salaries. One of the ancillary benefits, I guess, was that unlike many of us other students, they didn't have to go into debt. But they gave up a lifestyle that they were certainly used to and lived for years. And then a while ago, I learned or heard that they're still in the Northeast where they had started, and they're doing quite well. Not nearly as wealthy money-wise, but much wealthier in spirit and contentment. Now they actually, I heard, look forward to getting up each morning and facing each and every new day, and they do so with a spark that only Christ can provide. Their congregation is blessed to have them. They have a foundation that they run that's very well done and very important. They are remarkable people and do remarkable things. Of course, Christ doesn't call of us into the ordained ministry, but he does call each and every one of us to something, to a ministry of something. It's not important whether he calls us to great things or small, because he enlarges everything he touches. God called a widow to put her last penny into the collection plate. Jesus pointed her out to the disciples and said that people would remember her for the rest of their lives. Jesus called a boy to give 5 loaves and 2 fish. And when the boy obeyed, it fed 5,000 people. Back in the 50s, Christ called a man to use his gift of hospitality. This man put 2 extra plates at his table every Sunday and invited 2 young people from a nearby boarding school for wayward youth to share his Sunday dinner. He did this for many, many years, and in the process helped many young people to reinvest their energy into a positive way. When he died, the funeral home ran out of space because so many people came to honor this man who had honored Christ with 2 extra plates. Christ calls each of us to some sort of service. David McKenna, in his book, Love Your Work, tells of a tombstone in a village cemetery. The epitaph read, "Here lies Thomas Cobb, who mended shoes in the village for 40 years to the glory of God." Now imagine that. If you needed a pair of shoes mended, or maybe a car repaired, or a house built, or plumbing done, wouldn't you like to meet a cobbler, or a mechanic, or a carpenter, or a plumber who Christ had called to practice their trade to the glory of God? George Eliot wrote a poem about the great violin maker Antonio Stradivarius. God had called Stradivarius to make fine instruments, most of which were violins, but he made others. Eliot wrote the following words, as if Stradivarius had written them himself: "If my hand slacked, I should rob God. Point is that the world would have missed out in some of the finest made violins in the world if Antonio had not given his best to his craft in God. Okay, we're not different. God calls each of us to do the best we can in whatever we've been blessed with to his glory. How different would your job be if you viewed it as a calling from God? How differently would you do your job if you felt like Jesus was watching over you, not criticizing you, but blessing you? See, the truth is any job can be a ministry when we include Jesus in the equation. But it's not just a vocation that God calls us to. Just think of the many acts of Christian service to which Christ calls people every week in this church. We have greeters. We have ushers. We have liturgists. Liturgists? Oh, there she is. Okay, we have liturgists. We do have liturgists. We have people who sing in the choir. We have people who play. We have people who plant flowers, pay bills. We have people who attend meetings, teach Sunday school, perform a host of other duties, privileges for the glory of God. Each of these seemingly small duties may seem inconsequential by themselves, but woven together, they become a chorus of praise. Jacob Boehme put it this way. He said, "We are all strings in the concert of God's joy." Isn't that beautiful? We were all strings in the concert of God's joy. And so we are. Choir members know how important it is that each voice be precise in pitch and timing. Right, Joe? Right? We do the best we can. One person's hesitancy can actually muddy the whole line. If we're to make beautiful music together in this choir we call life, then we need to be in harmony with God's will. So, what has God called you to do for him? Maybe he's called you to be an elder or a deacon in this church. You might get that call in the next couple weeks when we prepare to elect new elders and deacons. And I hope if you do that you have the courage to say yes. Maybe he's calling you to serve on a church ministry committee like fellowship or building and grounds or church and world or youth or children's education, adult education. Visibility would make our gentleman over there very proud if you did that, right, Bill? Right, okay. Membership, worship and music. Or maybe he's just called you to teach a Sunday school class or work with our youth. Or maybe he's called you to be one of our sweaty sheep. Now, I know you were wondering, where was I going to work in the title of my sermon? Well, maybe he's called you to be a sweaty sheep by climbing up into the attic of this church and running a Cat 5 cable from the closet right outside there to the janitor's closet, which I did on Friday and lost 5 pounds of water. Now, I have to admit that I had some help on Saturday. Mike Manley got up and fixed some of the things I screwed up. He was not nearly as sweaty as I was, so I don't know. Point is that God calls all of us to some sort of service, and he's calling us by name. He's calling us to love him and to serve him. So my invitation this morning is to listen carefully. Listen prayerfully. And if you do, you too will feel the power and love of serving God and one another. And truthfully, there's no greater joy. Amen.